Setting up your setting up your meeting for Facebook Live.
Let me put my pronouns.
Ooh, wait. Now I got to get back to where we were.
And you're live.
You see us? Okay, great. Facebook Live.
Yeah, we're live.
Okay. I am just trying to transition to my notes here really quickly that disappeared. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending upon where you are. We want to welcome you to Facebook Live with the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture at Boston College. We are here with some of our good friends and I guess I'm here with some of my good friends and alums from Boston College. We would like to present to you tonight a panel that we are calling Unapologetically Black. I'm Dr. Carlton Green. I use he, him, and his pronouns. I'm currently at the University of Maryland. At some point after I do this introduction, we didn't talk about going around and allowing our panelists to introduce themselves. We have been providing these conversations really as a result of our experiences and our training, understanding how race and racism may be operating currently in the country, and trying to help people understand some of what they may be experiencing, or trying to help people understand what it is that they may be observing. We are here tonight really to talk about Blackness in a very unapologetic way. We recognize that this could be a difficult conversation for us primarily, but also maybe even for some viewers watching. We are here with the mindset that oftentimes Blackness can be weaponized in public spaces. And certainly when Black people talk very vulnerably about their experiences, it's quite possible that people can look at us and talk in very negative ways about who we are, or claim that we might be deficient in some type of way. And that's not why we're here tonight. What we hope for this discussion is that we're going to decenter whiteness and really talk about our experiences as Black people. One of the things that we often are tasked with doing in our workplace settings or in education settings is spending a lot of time helping white people understand what race means, or helping white people understand what whiteness means, or what racism means. And tonight, we are going to divest ourselves of that and really move into a space of talking about ourselves, and talking in ways about ourselves that we hope will speak to the experiences of Black people while also affirming Black people's experiences, no matter where you find yourself in the diaspora. You're going to hear us refer to racial identity development theory tonight, or Black racial identity development. And really, when we talk about that, what we're really talking about is the psychology of being a race person, the psychology of being a Black person, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that go along with that. And really, the development part is really our understanding of moving from a place where we have internalized racism and internalized standards of whiteness that will necessarily mean that we're not valuing ourselves, moving from that place, going to a place of much more positive, racial, healthy Black identity. So tonight, we're going to use our journeys and our stories to really highlight the nuance and the variability about our experiences to really inform how our own Black racial identity development has occurred. We want you to know as you listen that there is no one way to define Blackness. We are not here tonight to give one definition of what that means. We recognize that it's a real diasporic experience. We want you to know that there are layers and complexity to Blackness. We are not a monolithic experience. So in order to move from this place and begin to have the conversation, one of the things that we really want to highlight is what racial socialization actually is. And in the literature, it really says that this is the process that Black parents use historically to really prepare their Black children for facing a world that oftentimes does not like or appreciate or value Black bodies and Black people. And it actually prepares Black children to be able to survive in a world that is actually racist. So we're going to start off with some questions here, really talking about our own experiences of being Black folks. I'm going to turn to Keisha, who I guess will introduce herself, and then come on with the first question.
Sure, thank you, Carlton. So, hi everyone, my name is Dr. Keisha Basra. I am a staff psychologist at the University of Miami. So our first question for tonight is, As we think about our earliest experiences learning and hearing about Blackness, who was involved? So for me, my earliest memory learning about Blackness is walking in the streets with my mother, who is light skinned, almost white appearing, and my sister, who is also lighter skinned, a lighter shade than me, and having people question whether or not she was my mother. I remember hearing some folks say, "Is that your daughter?" Or "She's so dark compared to you," or "Her father must be dark skinned." For me, this was as early as the age of like 4 or 5 years old. So it was, pretty significant, like pretty early in my development. So for me, it started making me question my place, my belonging in my family, and it also made me look at my skin tone differently, because I started wishing that I had lighter skin, so I can be more similar to my mom and to my sister. So for me, this was like the beginning of my own struggles with internalized racism, or kind of being in the conformity pre-encounter stage, thinking that to be white was better than to be dark or to be Black. When it came for me, when towards adolescence, when it came to dating, I remember thinking my sister was more beautiful than me, and that she would probably get the guys because they'll be more attracted to her because of her skin tone as opposed to me. So I became more of a bookworm. So I focused my attention more on my education, and kind of, which is the area which I tended to excel in. So that's kind of one of the memories that kind of sticks with me to this day, as I think of my early racial socialization experiences. If my colleagues want to jump in and talk about some of their memories.
Sure. I can go ahead, because the last memory that you talked about is something that resonates with me. But as a way of contextualizing my own identity, I realized, I grew up way before all of you all on the panel. So I'm the older person here. And I also grew up in multiracial Los Angeles, so my socialization comes not in a predominantly white environment, but in a racially diverse environment that has very few Black people. So so the white folks aren't necessarily the majority, but we're talking about Armenians, folks who are Mexican, Mexican-American, Korean, Filipino, El Salvadorian. So you kind of get the whole sense of it. And so growing up, and my parents were activists. My mom and my dad met in the Congress Corps in the early 50s. They participated in the March on Washington in 1963. And my mom was this amazing woman who recreated herself, but someone who was very dark complected, had 3 children, and she met my father when she was divorced, and my father is white. And they get married in the 50s, which is like unheard of because it was illegal in many states, not in California. So this is just saying that as the context for my own personal development. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. When I think about my identity, it is more in terms of feeling at some points, not feeling as though I fit in or I belong in contexts that were not Black. And I'll give you some examples. And I've been really thinking through this a lot because I've been doing some work with a student of mine, because we always learn from our student, Andy Lee, who's doing this work on racial, ethnic, cultural belonging. So that fits a lot with what I'm doing. And we've also been working with Nidia Gracia and Amir Maksudi on notions of racial, ethnic, cultural uncertainty or not belonging. So I'm going to put my narrative in that. So some of the earliest memories, I remember being in, I started kindergarten at 4 because we were allowed to, and being there, and I apologize, all my examples are going to include Asian Americans. That's just the context. I remember a little girl, she's Asian American now, not wanting to play with me. And this is refusing to use her toy. But I knew at some point that there was something different about me, and it was something about my identity. So even as a 4-year-old, I'm beginning to understand and make sense of this. So flash forward. So I'm already beginning to feel like, oh, I don't quite fit in here. And those feelings kind of continue on. Another example, again, with a Chinese American neighbor. She lived 3 houses down from us. I go into her house and I just have that feeling. I think as Black folks, when we begin to think about our lives, we get like a sixth sense of things. We're able to go into a situation and assess that. So I developed that really early on. So I go into her house. I'm my second, third grade. I don't feel comfortable. And then, so when it comes to play with her again, I was like, oh, can we play? And she's like, oh, no, I can't play with you because my mom is prejudiced. So I was like, oh, okay. So I told my mom, and my mom is like, really? And she saw her mother, I don't know, at a store or where she saw her mom, but she followed her in her car, got out the car and confronted her, I'm sure in a very appropriate way. Hey, did you tell my daughter you're prejudiced? And of course she denied it, but I never we never connected. So throughout this, I have these series of things of, you don't fit, we don't want to be with you, you're not considered one of us. So really, it's not only it's a notion of anti-Blackness. And I have other stories of, being called the N-word, and wanting to fight over that. So my notion was, I didn't internalize that in the sense that, this has something to do with my race. I internalized it more as like, oh, I don't belong, or I don't fit in with these people. I'm different than. And now as an adult, I can clearly say, oh, this is anti-Blackness. This is this. So I think those are critical. And I was so thankful in 5th grade to have a Black girl my age come in. It was the first Black girl, and really feeling as though we fit together. And I got a sense of that was where my connection was. And that was important. And then there was a transition into junior high school. And I know a lot of theories talk about when you change context, your identity changes along with your development. So I'm getting more aware of the social construction of race in general, at the same time transitioning into a new environment that is also multiracial with very few Black folks. And I find a cadre of Black girls that I could be friends with, and we were friends all the way through high school. But Keisha, in high school, I felt much the way you do in terms of Black boys who are raised in either white settings or multiracial settings get to be thought of as cool and the desirable folks and the athlete or whatever the case might be. Black girls, what we get to be thought of as unattractive, undateable, undesirable, all those other things. And I too experienced that. I don't, at this point, I don't think I internalize it like, oh, I want to be something different. I just thought it was something about me. I never thought I was ugly, but it was hard to unpack what was really going on. But I definitely felt that, definitely didn't have any dates, definitely wasn't thought of as cool, definitely wasn't thought of as attractive. And it did provide me an opportunity to not center those relationships. I could go on and on, but I'll leave it at those kind of examples.
Can I just cut in 1 second here and ask you to introduce yourself?
Oh, and I'm Helen Neville. I'm a professor in Ed Psych and African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, counseling psychologist and rooted in Black studies. So.
Maybe I'll go next, because you were talking a lot about context, and it kind of reminded me of my process as I was actually going on my 3-mile run this afternoon before this webinar, and I was thinking what I'm going to share with the public. First of all, I really want to say thank you to ISPRC and Dr. Helms for creating the space for folks to come and talk, especially a space that we could talk about Blackness, which is seldom, it's hard to find. So thank you so much, and I'm honored to be here. So my name is Hector Adames. I am an Afro-Dominican. I'm an immigrant. I'm queer. My gender expression is non-binary. I use he, him, they pronouns and él pronouns. And I'm very anxious because I don't like to talk about myself. And I said this to Dr. Jernigan and Dr. Green, but I'm doing it because it's part of the work. So to contextualize a little bit about who I am outside of like my public profile or my public academic profile, I like to talk about the land that I was born into, which is Quisqueya, okay? And Quisqueya is the land that today has been, that we call Haiti and the Dominican Republic, okay? And I like to use Quisqueya because Quisqueya was the original name of the island before the colonizers came and really screwed everything up and divided the island into two, right? I grew up with the notion and with the idea of El Fuku. Y El Fuku, it sounds like F-U, but that's my own connotation. But El Fuku was a monster that I was raised to think if you do anything, you don't eat, if you lie, if you do X, Y, and Z, El Fuku is gonna get you. So I grew up with this notion of like, oh my God, this monster. And as I've been growing up and learning, I read and going back and understanding more about El Fuku is really a curse. And the curse of El Fuku is the curse of when the white Europeans came to Quisqueya and really screwed everything up. And I like to talk about that history because I think that history is in our veins for us who are Quisqueyanos, whether we are Quisqueyanos on the Haiti side of the island or Quisqueyano on the east side of the island of the Dominican Republic. Because this is the land where those looters came, screwed everything up. And it's the first space or the first space in the quote unquote new world on this side of the globe where Black, white, and indigenous folks actually met for the first time when we go back and think of history. And I think that has really shaped who I am as a person, who I am as a scholar, who I am in every space that I'm in. And I, as a Dominican who lives on the east side of the island, I like to talk about this particular perspective because there's so much tension in the island between Dominicans versus Haitian. And basically that is part of El Fuku that is still, it's still taking place today. So our history is connected, is wrapped, is intertwined with this idea of destruction. Our ability to survive through all these decades and our resistance and how we have resisted in different ways, shape, or form. And also how we have internalized El Fuku. And we have done a lot of, we meaning Dominicans, have done a lot of, and have a lot of anti-Black policies, beliefs, because we don't want to be like the Haitian, because even though the Dominican Republic is one of the Latin American countries that is predominantly of African descent. So again, I like to talk about this because it runs in my vein, this history runs in my vein. And when I thought of the question of what's my earliest experience, I think my earliest experience was there before I even had a language or a narrative to it. So I wanted to kind of contextualize where I come from. But really, when I think about my upbringing, Blackness was everywhere, right? Blackness was in the fragrance of the air, the sweet fragrance of the air. And that my connotation to that is to my grandfather, who was a very dark-skinned Black man. The food that we eat, el mofongo, right? The rhythm of our bachata, of our merengue. I also grew up with palo, which is not a very well-known type of music here in the United States. People just know more bachata and merengue. But palo is really the kind of spiritual dance and drumming that really comes from Africa, right? That beat that's always there. So kind of grew up with that. And that's also connected to the spirituality and the ways in which I was raised to kind of think about any stress, anything you're going through, you listen to different drummings, different callings that will really help soothe ourselves and things like that. in addition to those kind of pieces of Blackness in the way I grew up, other memories that I had, and I even had a conversation with my mom yesterday, was this beautiful, wonderful lady. Her name, we called her Mama Seba, right? And Mama Seba was our kind of, she fixed everything when it had to do with illness, you had worries, and she just, I don't know what she did, but whatever she did, it helped. And as a child, I was a very sick child. I was sick a lot. And so I developed a really intimate relationship with Mama Seba, right? So when I think about Blackness, I always think of her because she was always there healing me, right? This African looking woman. And also my grandfather, right? Who also loved me the way I don't think any of my other grandparents have loved me. Mama Seba, when I think of her, I think of her beautiful skin and how her skin matches my eye pupil. And even right now, I'm kind of envisioning her because it helps me kind of relax and ground myself. When I think of growing up, I also think of the way my father affectionately calls my mother Morena, right? Which means Black. It loses its connotation when I translate it into English, which is so, for me, it's so kind of dry. But Morena is an endearing, loving term that he calls my mother. So I grew up with my mother. I knew her name. I thought her name was Morena. And of course I called her mommy, not till later on I realized that her name is Rosa. And the other image that I remember growing up in the Dominican Republic is our houses are of cement, okay? So if you've ever been to the Caribbean or you have Caribbean families, we don't put holes in the wall. Even the United States, we try not to put holes in the wall. And the reason why, it's because you don't want to make holes and then the walls might fall and things like that. But there were two pictures in the living room of the house that I grew up. One of them was a picture of my mother's oldest brother who died in a motorcycle accident. I never met him because he died before I was born. And the other picture was of Jose Francisco Peña Gomez, who was a Dominican-born man who his parents were Haitian and they had to flee the Dominican Republic back to Haiti because of El Trujillato. And he was able to run for president. He ran, I believe, 3 or 4 times, don't quote me, but you could Google it, 3 or 4 times, I don't remember. And of course, he never won because of the way he looked and because, again, people thought he wasn't a quote unquote real Dominican. So those are some of my earlier memories when I think of Blackness. And even thinking about it, it was really hard for me to pinpoint, like, what was it? Because I felt like it was just always there, right? And then, of course, then I came to the United States and realized and learned how Blackness is understood here. And in kind of putting all those pieces together, understand that, you know, racism and anti-Blackness has no borders. And I'll talk more about that later on. But those are some of my earlier memories when I think about Blackness and my upbringing. Thank you for listening.
I'm Miriam Jernigan-Owesi. I am an assistant professor of psychology at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia, which is just outside of Atlanta. Also a licensed psychologist and consultant. In thinking about the question, Keisha's question, just about my earliest memories and constructions of Blackness, the context for me is that I am the youngest of 4. So I, often sort of wonder, what life was like before me in terms of my siblings. But certainly by the time that I arrived, my earliest just sort of memories, and I could literally, there's sort of these visual flashbacks, are of parents who were very intentional about what the inside of our home looked like. So the pictures in our home reflected, a variety of different Black and brown faces. We had, I remember, a bookshelf, and this was back in the day when people sold encyclopedias in sets, and they had like the Encyclopedia of Black History, right? And that was really, I remember them being really proud to have this huge set. I think they still have some, their bookshelf in their home to this day. But just, the images that I see, the content that was around, myself and my siblings, the community related events that we went to, the things that they had us read. So there also just the explicit verbal messages, and then just kind of the undertones that were there. And I think my parents often instilled a history, of Black history in particular. And I think that was reinforced where I was. I grew up in the Northeast, let me say that. Self-identify as Black, racially and ethnically as African-American, with very strong Southern roots from my mom's side of the family. And so that's important for me, because there's something about my mother's narrative that really informs how she parented us and what was important for her. She talked actually most recently, and I can come back to this a little bit later, most recently being a few weeks ago, I had one of the first conversations with her in the context of what's for some folks, a racial awakening. My mother was reflecting on growing up, right, in the South, and like through the, being young, and thinking about the civil rights movement, and just she was talking about, sort of the Ku Klux Klan. And so for her, though, she started out early childhood in segregated schools. So she talked about, having Black teachers, and just the importance of education, and the importance of history, and the importance of pride and being Black. And that's really, I think, what she really tried to very intentionally teach her children, and surround us with. I was sharing with folks that I found very recently in decluttering my house a picture of myself when I was little, when I wore braids and beads, and like the beads in my hair were red, black, and green. When as folks, Kwanzaa became popular, my parents hosted Kwanzaa parties. So there were these messages about, sort of having and being intentional about having a sense of pride and knowing one's history beyond, right, the idea of slavery or what was taught in school, and these messages about learning outside of school. So there being other resources, right, to really understand and learn, and I think value your worth. And there was also messages, I think, about the fact that outside of these walls, the narrative around what Blackness is and will be is going to be different. And I witnessed that, again, having older siblings, and certainly had my own experiences, as some folks have described here. Those memories in terms of just counter narratives to those messages of Black pride that my parents attempted to instill, came at the hands of peers and teachers, and even witnessing some of my friends, my Black friends, for example, be challenged by teachers with regard to, whether or not they wrote a particular paper if someone felt like it was too good for a Black student to write, those sorts of things. But my earliest memories, I will say, are ones really of just sort of, here's your history, know your history, understand, the sacrifices of your elders. And I don't think in hindsight that I truly appreciated what they were doing and how intentional they were until I became older and had the opportunity to look back on, oh, wow. So this was actually really intentional. Now having a child of my own, really understanding, right, what goes into just the messages, the exposure, and the attempt really to educate us. Again, my being the youngest and my siblings being older, so maybe witnessing some of the conversations from my older siblings, but really having them also talk about, how it is that you can come to counter those messages. And we took trips down south every summer, almost to see, my grandparents and to see cousins. And I remember they would stop, we would drive. We were a family of 6. So I remember we'd stop in places like Baltimore and go to the Black Wax Museum. And my mother would always say, I have these really significant memories of, there were times when I was a little bit younger and I was a little uncertain about some of the, is this movie going to be scary? If it was, something related to just the images, seeing the civil rights movement and things like that on Eyes in the Prize. And my mother would always say, I'm going to be here with you. We can talk about it. I'm not going to leave you, but it is important for you to know this. And she was very good about, exposing us to those things that were developmentally appropriate, but also, kind of navigating truth with the reality of what she knew I would, likely go on to face as a Black girl, and now, Black woman.
I don't know, it's interesting listening to you all talk about these socialization experiences or these early memories about being Black. I have been thinking about this all day, and the pieces that keep coming to mind for me really revolve around looking back on them without having any explicit messages about Blackness, And some of them will probably be very, I guess they're cultural, but some people will probably think of them as being very stereotypical. I just remember growing up I'm from Monroe, Louisiana, or I grew up in Monroe, Louisiana, which is a small town in the northeastern part of the state. Probably about 50 to 60,000 people. I think it's always been sort of like maybe like the seventh or eighth largest city in Louisiana, which, is not large by any stretch, but it's still, in the top in the state. And the things that I look back on and think about as being socialization experiences are things like getting up and going to church and staying pretty much for a long time on Sundays, and having your ear pulled if you got out of line in church, or um, having to having my mama come to the porch of our house and call out for me like at 8 o'clock at night when the sun was going down, and the lights were coming on, that I need to come in the house, right? And probably come in the house smelling like a wild animal because I've been out playing all day with people up and down the street. Or thinking about like getting home, or being in the house and watching like Sanford and Son, or some other like really old, I guess maybe that's old, I don't know, some old television show with Black characters on it. Having the sense of food that felt really Southern, but for me, I think as I grew up and was in white people's houses, realized, oh, this is Black Southern food. It's not even just a Southern food. There's something that's Black and Southern about it. So really thinking about some of those pieces that I don't know that I mean, when I was growing up younger, I don't recall a lot of explicit conversation about Blackness in my household. I was the only adopted child of my parents, and my parents divorced early, soon after, well, like maybe when I was 5 or something like that. And so there's a piece of me that thinks about them tending to life the way life had been, so the life that they had that didn't necessarily involve some of these pieces around Blackness. But I definitely think that there were just these cultural artifacts, if you will, or these cultural factors that sort of like always affirmed for me that I was Black. And even sort of like looking back on them, or when I got to maybe like high school and I began to have like white friends, and I would visit their homes and see things or observe how things were happening with them, I think though it helped me to look back and to see what my mom was really doing around helping me to feel like a Black person, or to be a Black person, or one way, right, of being a Black person. And so those are the things that come to mind for me when I think about the earliest memories.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because we tend to think about, or at least, and this is the sort of scholarly piece, right? When we think about, facilitating what we call, racial identity development. So just that positive definition of what Blackness is, a lot of emphasis is put on the importance of racial socialization messaging. So what are we telling kids about race, verbally or otherwise? And I think a lot of folks tend to talk about racial socialization in the context of, here are the verbal messages, like what are folks saying? And I hear, us talking about the fact that it was sort of, it's in the air. There are other ways in which, racial socialization happens. And that piece I'm sort of curious about as we think about beyond just the either explicit or not so explicit, messages around Blackness in the areas where we grew up, where we existed, where we, have tried to thrive, and where we do thrive. Racial socialization is active. It's always occurring, and it is contextual. So I'm curious, in addition to some of the stories that you all shared, and I think we started to touch on some of this even from a community perspective, right? What are, I guess, some of the ways in which, right, our communities and the places in those communities really instilled definitions or ideas about Blackness as well? And as I said, I think we all kind of started to tap on that, but it'd be interesting to hear us expand upon that a little bit more in terms of those places where we grew up and across our lifespans.
For me, the thing that really jumps to mind almost immediately is, going back to that neighborhood where I grew up, which is an all Black neighborhood, on the, the wrong side of the tracks, if you will, according to everybody. and growing up in that neighborhood, playing with all of my little Black friends, and hearing people often say things about how smart I was, and it was almost like you were a smart little Black boy, which, you know, in those moments you don't really think too much about it. Although I felt like there was a compliment in there, and it was always married to being Black, right? So there were some things that was supposed to be good about that. I remember going to church, and there were also very similar messages there about like being a smart little Black boy. A lot of the older Black women were very affirming of that. Certainly, I think my mother would be talking about my accomplishments at school. And so people were giving me the message both in the neighborhood and the community, like, if you keep doing this, like, somebody will pay for you to go to school, right? And there was a way that the community was really contextualizing the smartness with Blackness. That was also complicated because I think that there are ways of thinking about what were they saying to the other Black boys. It makes me wonder about how somebody who maybe didn't have the grades that I had, what was happening with their Blackness, or what was happening with them with regards to affirmation. And then of course in school, I think my kindergarten teacher was a white woman, but I think from like first grade, no, maybe my first grade teacher was a white woman too, but then after that I began to have Black teachers, and they too had this way of affirming being a Black person and being smart and really kind of extolling those things together. So I think that for me, there was always something that I was picking up about, something good about being smart and being Black, but also something maybe unique about being smart and Black that, you know, I look back on it and there are some really complex messages in there. I think one of the first real experiences that I had that may have been triggering for my own racial identity development was when white students came to my elementary school. For the first time. We were integrating in the 5th grade. Up until that point, it was an all Black school with white teachers, but we were all Black students. And I remember some of my Black friends and I were waiting for a bus to arrive, and we were waiting for some of our Black friends to come. And a bus came, and I think somebody that I knew, a Black girl, got off the bus, and one of my white teachers, who was in the Gifted and Talented program, came up and actually took my friend to the office because she said that her shorts were too short, right? And that she needed to go home, or that, you know, that she was violating the dress code. So it was really weird. I don't know how, I can't remember exactly how the stuff happened, but I remember we were also waiting to see if the teacher was going to be consistent in that. And then a bus came in with from one of the white neighborhoods, and the white girl got off, and I swear her shorts were even shorter or as short as my Black friend. And it was one of those, I don't know how I would be able to define this right now, but it was one of those moments of awakening to see that we were being treated differently. And being really upset about that, and being really torn up and hurt, actually, because the woman who was involved was one of my teachers, this white woman. And I remember all of the consternation of having to go to her class that day, having to sit in there and being really angry, and then having to go to the next class and to have the other gifted teacher tell me that Miss Crawford didn't mean any harm, like she really cared about us, she loved us, or whatever. And also feeling like I needed to rebuff that. But this knowledge of something is different, something is happening different here. And so there's so like this dualistic message of being the smart Black boy, but observing that something is happening, and not having a lot of maturity to make sense out of it, but I knew something was different.
Yeah, schools are really interesting places. Interesting, right? In terms of the messages that get communicated explicitly. As you were talking, Carlton, it reminded me of like similar moments, and I would say more so in high school, where you begin to see, you know, you can look at the demographics of a particular school, and it might be, for all intents and purposes, at least my high school was, you know, somewhat, you know, racially, ethnically diverse, and yet in whether they were advanced placement classes or other classes I might have been taking, you know, I'm one of few people of color. And so I remember, and I have a very dear friend who was at another high school with very similar experiences. And so yes, these messages around sort of how teachers and administrators even may have interacted with me at that point some of them, right, at that point in terms of, yes, being special, but also being very conflicted and starting to, sort of question what it means to, right, when you're coming into school, everyone's around, and then somehow, depending on classes and sort of paying attention to when you're selecting classes and who's recommended, for certain classes and how that continues, along the educational trajectory, but how you begin to receive and internalize in some ways, messages around who's smart, right, and who's not. And so there was, I think, even for me, and I would have just, described myself, we sort of go back when I'm reminiscing with friends about my levels of immersion, even as, a high school student or an adolescent, in terms of being very pro-Black, but at the same time, going from high school to attending a historically Black college and university, which was a very powerful experience. But I remember having a very distinct conversation with my best friend about the fact that, you're in this place where everybody's Black, as in terms of students, right, or Black identified and smart, right? And that was such, it wasn't, it was interesting because we were confronting, right, even nuanced aspects of internalized racism, right? If we were being real with ourselves in that moment, because it's just like everybody's smart. It's not just, right, the chosen few that, get reinforced and are interacted with in that way in school systems, which is probably one of the reasons I'm so passionate about advocating in schools, because, it's at the peer level, it's at the, teacher to student level, it's at the administrative to student level, it's at the policy level. And it is, I think even for a child that, like as I said, for myself, that may have had some grounding and was taught to, think critically and could have conversations, still, right, these aspects in terms of what does that mean and why is smart so important? And then I think even generationally for generations, right, that the smartness was supposed to make you be able to go further, do something, have access to more, which was part of the community encouragement. And yeah, and having a very different view of that right now.
That reminds me kind of, since you both are talking about earlier on when you were younger, which sounds like you both were super cute. I'm thinking of envisioning you as little ones kind of running around. But when I think of my community, first of all, I really want to say our Latino community, when it comes to race, and in particular, Blackness, it's a hot mess. I mean, it is a hot mess today in 2020. But it's been a hot mess for centuries, right? And when I think about my community, I think about how confusing it is to be a person of African descent, to be a Black Latino, growing up in at least in my Dominican context. And the confusion comes in because we don't talk about quote unquote race, at least the way we think about race, right? We don't talk about it. We get encouraged to hush hush, yet we're constantly talking about it in a direct way. And I think that that is confusing as I'm thinking in terms of a child understanding, is it okay to talk about this? But I see you all are talking about this. We're hearing music that is talking about no le pegue a la negra, right? Like don't hit the Black woman. But we're not supposed to talk about race. Yeah, so growing up as an Afro-Dominican in a family that literally we have the entire rainbow of colors in the family was very, very, very confusing. Now my legs just hurt because my mom is constantly kicking me under the table when it's, when we're at dinner. She's like, ahí va tú otra vez. But really, when I think about it, I think of like the messages I heard growing up with my tios who would date non-Black Dominicans, and how everybody like loved my aunts, right? The one in particular that I'm thinking of, they divorced, which makes a lot of sense, but I'm not gonna put their business out there so much, right? But that's what I grew up in, right? Like, well, why didn't this other person who's dating a Black Dominican, why are they not getting the same accolades, right? And I share that, although I witnessed that. I don't think it's unique to my family. I think it's unique to the Latin American experience, but for sure for the Dominican experience, right? We have dichos, which are sayings that really speak to our skin color, et cetera, et cetera. The other piece is, in terms of the message I got, I used to walk around with my grandmother. We would go to the market, and we would go to the market every day because that's just the custom in the Dominican Republic. And we would walk around with huge umbrellas. Everybody walked around with huge umbrella. And I never questioned it because that's just the way we did things around there, right? And I just thought, that's what we do when we go outside and it's sunny. We get our big umbrella. And really, when thinking about it, is they don't want us to get darker than we already are. It's a way to kind of maintain that, you know, be on the lighter side of the entire skin color gradient. So I kind of really grew up with those messages that I received, so it was very, very, very confusing. So I migrated to this country at the age of 5, 6. Actually, it was the month I was turning 6. And I would always go back to the Dominican Republic for the summertime. So I kind of lived in 2 contexts. Okay, and the memory that I have about growing up here in the United States, I went to a school named Holy Trinity. It's a Roman Catholic school, and I was the darkest, and I was the only Latino there because it was a private school. I come from a working class family, and my mother worked 3 jobs to put me in private school. And little did she know that I was actually the way they were treating me, but also that they would put me behind the door because I would talk a lot. I had a lot of questions. I still do. I had a lot of questions back then. And there were no ESL classes back in the 80s when I migrated to this country. So I literally did not speak a lick of English, as they say. They put me into this private school. My parents thinking they're doing the best that they can for my education, yet here I am being traumatized, right? Being ridiculed, right? For talking a lot. And looking back, was it really for talking a lot? I would venture to say, maybe, but maybe not. I wish I could share some pictures. I should have thought about that, but I had a huge big afro. I think I shared it with Dr. Neville, that picture, right? So and I'm thinking back of myself, this little twig with this big afro. I look like a mushroom, talking all the time in Spanish because I didn't speak English. And the way that the message was, be quiet. And the message of putting me behind the door was, we need to hide you, right? I will never forget Sister Joseph. And I also say that this silencing of Blackness within my Latino community, it's suffocating. The silence is suffocating. We don't talk about it, right? We don't talk about it so much within our families, but also in the academy, we don't talk about it. We have an entire Latino psychology field. You could probably count with both your hands in psychology how race is written or talked about. Right? And this idea of we're all the same, right? This idea of mestizaje, racial ideology. We're all the same. And because of that, race doesn't matter. So for us, it's less of a colorblind lens. We see race, but the way we interpret it is that we're all the same. And therefore, we all have the same experience. And here in the United States, we have an entire subfield within psychology that continues to support and uplift that nonsense. And it's suffocating. And right now, because of all the anti-Blackness and all the everybody's subtly woke, now you have folks, not just in psychology, but across academia, who are capitalizing on the experience, on the pain that we all are sharing, our socialization as people of African descent, as Black folks, right? And there's this academic looting that's taking place. And we need to call that out, because that's only benefiting us, well, them personally and professionally. It's really not dismantling the toxicity, the ugliness that we folks of African descent experience, that anti-Blackness. So when I think of community, I think of the Dominican Republic, migrating here, my own family, my tios, my tias, and then also the field, because Latino psychology is also part of my community.
Mm.
So.
It's hard to follow that one. Thank you, Hector, for sharing. That's very poignant stories. So for me, growing up, I grew up in the Bronx, New York, which is primarily Black and Hispanic neighborhood that I lived in. Unfortunately, we didn't see many positive images of Black folks, Black or brown folks in my community, especially in watching the nightly news. It was always something related to like violence or something, or drugs in the neighborhood. I grew up in the 80s, so I was kind of like at the height of like the, you know, crack epidemic, right? And so I remember like growing up and seeing like crack bottles in our parks and stuff. So that was what's around it by when I was growing up. And I know Hector talked a little bit about being Dominican. I'm Haitian, and so my parents, or my mom and my uncles, they really instilled in me the education. So that's where we were supposed to kind of like excel, and we couldn't be like other Black folks, right? We had to like, you know, focus on going to school. I stayed in my partner jokes with me a lot about this. He was like, you were always in the library. You don't know about this life, like, you know, so, and it's true. Like, I remember like, you know, being 8 years old, 9 years old, my mother went to the library, or sometimes me and my sister would go up the block to go to the library and get books. And that's where we would stay. We wouldn't really be hanging out in the streets with the other Black kids, because we would try to say that you were different from these black children, right? You're Haitian, your you know, your family, your parents are immigrants. You need to excel in this way because you have to give 110% because you don't want to be labeled as, you know, being lazy or uneducated. So those were the messages that I remember getting from my family. And then when I was in school, my teachers would see, oh, you're different from these other Black students. So there was always just like putting me aside from like other, you know, students in my class, which was, I mean, in some ways it helped my self-esteem, but then also like made me an outsider of like my peers, right? I remember like my best friends when I was growing up was a Asian American and a Dominican female. Some of the Black kids didn't really want to associate with me because they felt like I was different. And also in the 80s, it was like a heightened kind of prejudice against Haitians because of like the AIDS epidemic. And so there was just always like pushing me aside. I felt like I was always like the outsider. It wasn't until I went to college, actually, when I went to a predominantly white school, that I started really hanging out with other African Americans and other Black students, because there were so few of us at the school. So I joined like the Black Student Union. That's when I really kind of started, you know, spending more time with other African American students, and they started, you know, seeing me as a Black person. So I think that was a very interesting kind of experience for me. I think I would say that when I was in college, that's when I started to research more about my Black history. All my papers would be geared towards like learning more about Haitian history and African American history. I was Africana Studies minor when I was in college. So I would say I was kind of going to my immersion racial identity stage at that point. Some of the things I remember growing up in my neighborhood, there was like, I remember Black women never really being happy with their hair texture. So we were always getting our hair relaxed, going to the Dominican hair salons and getting that blowout because we didn't want to like, we wanted to look more like the white woman, to have that straight hair. And those were the messages that were being portrayed in the media too. this is what you need to get your hair relaxed. I remember like the relaxer at that time was probably like gentle treatment or dark and lovely. So those were the images that I kept on seeing, you know, in the media. And then also like going to the beauty supply stores, there would be images of women, Black women having lighter skin. So there was like, they were highlighting the skin whitening creams for Black women around the time. I would say that probably like the early 90s. So those are the images I remember like getting in my community, which were very damaging, you know. I still think about it to this day, and like, just imagine like seeing young girls seeing, you know, these images and like what it was doing to their self-concept, you know. So I don't know, it was very powerful experiences.
Yeah, I feel like the experiences are so, the community experiences can be so, you know, nuanced. And, you know, in so many ways, I think about like, what are the places, if we go back to that question of community, it's, you know, we talk a little bit about schools, you know, beauty salons, barbershops, community-based event. My parents are still, right, really big on community service. So I just sort of have these visions of like being in the Black sections of the town that I grew up in, so to speak, and whether you were doing, you know, some community service event or just being a part of, you know, a community based event. But in hindsight now, right? So the foundation I talked about a little bit earlier, but yes, in hindsight, kind of looking at just the nuance of the message in terms of the ways in which one could be, you know, encouraged and reinforced, and the beauty of Blackness, and yet, you know, in thinking about some of the more subtle messaging, I think even, you know, in that, whether it was going to family reunions or being in different places, again, when I felt like when I was outside of the, well, initially I felt like, right, in hindsight, when I was outside of the walls of my house, is when, you know, more of those messages, for me at least, kind of seeped in terms of anti-Blackness. But in hindsight, even when I reflect on that, like, yes, if I'm sitting in the beauty salon, like I will say I grew up in the beauty salon church and the beauty salon, long days in church and long Saturday mornings in the beauty salon. And yes, so just hearing and listening to Black women, older Black women talk, and, you know, again, sort of the ways in which people would unite around certain things, but then also, yes, you know, I think since the invention of the hot comb, right, that sort of idea through the 80s and the 90s of what hair should, you know, look like. And then, you know, just even who gets attention, so to speak. So who gets talked about, who gets revered, and in what way, and in what ways are, you know, folks given reverence with regard to, you know, characteristics and things of that nature. I can't, so it's this interesting piece for me where I was given this sort of foundation. I'm positive, right, that there, you know, has been some internalization of some of the negative messages, but I think more of that awareness, I would agree, Keisha, for me, even going to an HBCU and just being angry at the fact that part of our core curriculum was African American heritage, the world and its peoples. Like that was in forever, right, an experience for me that I will love. But I remember my African American heritage course was taught by a white professor, and he was teaching me things that I hadn't learned before about my history and myself. And I was upset because these books were readily available. And I remember saying that I had to go back, and in my mind, I was reconstructing like the history that had been taught to me. And I was like, well, wait, you're telling me that this happened then, but then I learned this right in high school. So like and at the end of the day, for me, what it was about is, if this information is readily available, how come nobody, you know, why aren't we being taught this across the board? Why aren't all children being taught this? And I remember being upset, not at the, well, for a couple of reasons. Honestly, I was upset that that my white professor knew more than I did, you know, honestly. And then also, like I said, sort of, you know, thinking about just the importance and the richness from a global perspective of Black people and Blackness, and just people of, you know, people of color as well from a global perspective. So even challenging language, you know, around being minorities and that sort of thing really came from me in college, and facilitated this awakening from a community perspective. And I still feel very much so connected to the HBCU community, you know, today, and those folks that I really grew up with. And that was also a period where I started to challenge even some of, you know, my parents, as I think about the intersections of Blackness with regard to, like, yes, they like some other folks I know, yes, they can sort of talk about Blackness, but let's look at, Blackness and gender and, things of that nature. And that's where I began to sort of challenge and have arguments, I think, battles, debates with them about, religion and things like that, which were a little bit different. So I think about my racial identity journey and having what I thought and still think is a pretty strong foundation. I still recognize that context was so pivotal for me at certain points.
I think that's really powerful too, in terms of talking about having a strong foundation and still having other pivotal points. And I know for me, I had a really strong, I think pretty strong foundation about the importance of African American history, our contributions to the world and our society in particular. So one of the critical pieces of socialization was the school, and was the school setting. And I think as a Black girl being socialized in a public school setting is that oftentimes we get forgotten or left out. We're not thought of as smart or engaging. And I feel really fortunate that in my family, to be Black meant to be smart. So when I didn't test to get put into these gifted classes, I'm like, I'm going to gifted classes. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to roll myself in them because that's what it means to be Black. But that doesn't really counter some of these other messages. Well, you should probably take these classes. They might be too hard. Well, maybe you shouldn't get your doctorate. That might be too hard. I mean, these constant messages, but I know what I did was I fought through that every step of the way. And the way though that that it shows up now, because I didn't get the messages that you all got, that you were brilliant and smart, for a Black person or whatever. And so what that means is if we're not giving myself or these other Black girls those messages, when you get older, you feel as though, or I have felt as though, oh, I don't have time to take up this space. Or when you experience, I know we all have experienced imposter phenomena where you feel like, oh, you don't belong in that space. You're not as smart as other people. You don't have, that gets exacerbated if you have these other racial gender messages that Black girls aren't smart, or you aren't this, or these other things. So the notion of the way even I experience imposter phenomena of second guessing myself, part of that is this larger ways in which I've been socialized in these broader institutions that had nothing to do with being socialized in my home environment. I just think about also the ideas of having these dreams, like what dreams can we have? What is possible for our lives? And how sometimes these external forces can really shrink our dreams. So when I think about my mom, this dark complected Black woman who was born during the Depression and grew up in these ways, that she had to fight her way to create new dreams. But the dreams she had and was able to actualize were a lot more limited because of racial and gender and class oppression that she experienced. So I feel like my own dreams have been kind of the scope of what I thought was possible growing up was limited compared to what I see, all of this fabulous work that younger folks are doing, that there's like, yes, we can do this, this is possible. And I feel like the ways in which racism and anti-Blackness and as its intersection with gender when I was growing up limited that in some ways.
As you're talking about that, Dr. Helen, one of the things that was coming to me with the reference to the dreams is that a part of my Blackness, and I'm hearing maybe for some of y'all too, is that education gets equated with the dreams, right? There's a real way that we have adopted education because it's a very complicated relationship that we have. Because I'm listening to all of us talk about schools being really brutal places for us too, right? And nobody really says that school is going to be a brutal place, but we do hear all of the messages about education or being smart or being brilliant or something about education really being important, right? And just listening to it, I'm thinking like, oh, I wish somebody would have said, or maybe if I would have had the maturity to realize how dangerous schools were, because even as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about, oh, this happened in 5th grade, and that happened in 7th grade, and this happened in 10th grade. Like there are all these pieces that felt like it was about being Black in these school settings and not being welcome, or people's anti-Blackness evidencing itself, You got enough awards, you don't need to go for this one. Or, so like people also kind of like squelching some parts of it as they saw, even I think about Carol Anderson's White Rage, right? So me moving forward, and then also having to experience white people's sort of like pushback around being smarter, being progressive, or achieving things was also a part of the experience. As I was listening to y'all as well, I think I was capturing or picking up on the range of emotion that comes along with these stories too, which can also be really, really challenging for us sometimes. Because I think that, one of the ways that Blackness can be very emotional, put it that way. Blackness can be a very emotional experience. But one of the things that happens, right, for us, for me, one of the things that happened for me is that I think that there were times when my mom might have been policing my body about sitting down, being quiet, don't do this, right? So like kind of putting a cap on that, some of the emotional expression. And so in some ways, we're always getting these messages about our bodies, and we know that our bodies carry emotion. And so our emotion is oftentimes surveilled or policed or limited, or we get taught in some ways that we need to contain ourselves in order to be able to fit in a lot of spaces. And so it can be really disruptive for how we relate to our own bodies and how we relate to emotion. And I know even as we were having our preparation conversation, there was some mention of that. So like, were we feeling stuck? Were we feeling hesitant? Is it about making ourselves vulnerable? Is it about being emotional in some spaces? A lot of it because of the way that people talk really, or we have so like this disconnected experience from our own emotions when it comes to our Blackness in some ways.
So maybe can we talk a little bit about our range of emotions within our Blackness, including the anger?
Gonna kick us off?
Even though anger is usually the one that folks just automatically kind of, automatically puts the label on us. I'm sorry, Helen.
Were you gonna kick us off?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I said, are you gonna kick us off?
Oh, sure, I could. So, when I think of emotions, right, and I say this all the time to my students. I teach master's level therapists, folks who want to be therapists. We always spend at least 3 hours talking about what's emotion, what's feeling, what's emotion, and what's feeling. So after our prep meeting that we had, I started playing around with that with myself. So I'll share the way I kind of think about it. So I view emotions as that subjectivity that we're experiencing internally that no one really knows, right? It's that stuff that we still haven't put a narrative to or a label to. And then I view feelings, the actual label, the actual narrative that we put to that internal subjective thing that we're experiencing, right? Also reminds me of my clients when I do therapy, that you ask folks, how are you feeling? And people are searching. They have such a hard time. I feel, and oftentimes people say, I feel some type of way, right? I know I say that all the time. And that kind of highlights that piece, that emotion is that uncooked, raw, internal subjective experience that we still haven't processed with words. So when it comes to our Blackness, I think, at least for my community and for myself earlier on in my racial identity development, I was feeling some type of way about my Blackness. I didn't have the language to put it to, right? And if you kind of think back to my socialization and mestizaje racial ideology and different things like that. Anyway, so I kind of really wanted to kind of play around with kind of that distinction. But folks are observing us, right? And they make all sorts of assumptions based on the way we are expressing our emotion, which may or may not be accurate based on our internal subjective, what I call uncooked raw experience, right? And my experience has been folks, particularly non-Black folks or folks of color who are confused and are early on in their racial identity, only like to hear about emotion that makes them feel good, right? Yet when I'm expressing or trying to find words to express my anger, my disappointment, right? Folks don't want to hear that narrative about my emotion. So again, it's always this kind of duality that we have to go in and out when we're kind of thinking about emotions and feelings and a range of emotion and Blackness and things like that, right? So folks love that we're joyful, most of us, that we're happy, that we have swag, that, you know, we have intensity, aka passion, we have quick wit. But if the content of that whatever those emotions are, is in a way that's making the other feel some type of way for them, they don't like it. They don't want to hear about it. We're shut down, right? Angry Black woman, right? The dangerous Black man, right? You all, I'm seeing the head now, so you know what I'm talking about. So when I then share my emotions, whether it's joy, happiness, the beauty of our Blackness and our African descentness, with folks who are healthy in their racial identity, or even non-Black folks who are healthy in their racial identity, I feel healing. I feel validated. I feel grounding in some way, shape, or form, right? And in other spaces, I feel that our emotions are a threat to folks, which would then help explain all the institutional oppression and the way we're kind of impacted. Yeah, so I'm very mindful and intentional in the spaces that I'm in, and I assess those spaces, and I try to assess where those folks are in their racial identity. And, you know, and I'm intentional about my emotions that I'm gonna try to verbally process with them. So.
I really, Dr. Adamas, I appreciate you kind of separating those out. And I do think emotions and affect is so much part of our kind of experience as Black folks. And I think there's a couple comments that I want to make about this. So when I think about being Black, I'm filled with joy and pride and just a tremendous amount of positivity, affinity. However, when I think about my experiences with anti-Blackness in the world, so it is separate from my experience of Blackness, I experience all of this wonderfulness. And I would not want to be, I am so glad I am a Black woman in this world. And that is an important critical identity. But my experiences with anti-Blackness growing up through my elementary, junior high school, because that's what we called it, high school things, an affect, it's not like memories, but an affect of feeling pain and loneliness and isolation and a whole bunch of hurtful, painful things, not because I'm being Black, but because I've experienced intense anti-Blackness throughout my career. And I really want to separate those out to have my feelings a bit, because I don't think I internalized that as to like, oh, it hasn't dampened my sense of Blackness. But there is a pain, and the way that the pain kind of works now is anger, disillusionment, not toward being Black, but at anti-Blackness and racism, rage. I don't trust white folks. I mean, it seems as though on a whole, I want to open up myself and things, and then they prove me where like, now this is exactly why I don't trust y'all. So I think so I wanted just to make a distinction between my experience of Blackness and my experience with anti-Blackness. So.
I appreciate that. I love the distinction. I think is really important. When we were talking about this sort of topic, I think the distinction for me becomes even more important because I was talking about the fact that there are very few places or spaces, I feel, at least in where Black people are able to discuss in an authentic way the painful aspects of anti-Blackness. We survive through it, right? We sort of move through it. And Carlton, something you said earlier about the fact that there's a warning, but not the level of forewarning that you need, even as a child going through school systems, for example. And so you just keep going. And so here we are in hindsight, reflecting and thinking, oh, right. So when do we have the opportunities to name and to separate that out and to still, right, be unapologetically Black and to, be prideful and accept that while also talking about acknowledging, validating the pain, the anger, and those other emotions because of the messages, related to anti-Blackness really teach us, right, that our presence, the space, right, that we allegedly take up so much space. And so we've got to become palpable, right, for predominantly white systems and around other folks. And that is, I think, very separate. So I appreciate that, Dr. Helen, as well, in terms of, that's in response to, right, what's being imposed upon me versus really where I am now. And it does make me, more upset because I sometimes will joke and it's like, I just woke up, I'm just trying to have a good day, right? And then along comes, an incident, a news, anything, turn on the TV, read something. It's like, I'm just trying to be here and be Black and happy and live. And, there are all these ways in which anti-Blackness absolutely surrounds you. And you are, in essence, it's almost like a battle, right, against, thinking about and trying not to internalize. And again, as a mom, really trying to now navigate this journey with a little one. So I'm swatting, anti-Blackness as, for as long as I can while I'm trying to instill and fill up his cup. So I very much so appreciate your sharing that. And I encourage, I think, all of us to really think about creating the spaces to create the narrative, to name the feeling that goes along with the emotion, right? Tap into the emotion and learn to name the feelings, because otherwise it lives in us. And Carlton and I, we're talking about this, and then it becomes, right, what festers and what we talk about with regard to disparities around health, et cetera. It's gonna live in the body if we don't create the narrative and learn to talk about it regardless of who's ready to hear it or who wants to hear it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you making the distinction too, Dr. Helen, because I was thinking about how, whether or not I'm training or whether or not I'm watching TV, like Miriam is saying, or when I'm with other people or in a school setting, thinking that, trying to get people to understand that racism and anti-Blackness hurt, and Black people being angry as a result of those is actually a very legitimate response. It's a legitimate emotional response to being harmed or being relegated to less than. And it seems really hard in some ways for us to allow Black people to have that anger, which is, I think about, Audre Lorde and so many other people who have written about the necessity of anger in our lives. And so I wish that people would stop mischaracterizing our anger and really see it for the life-giving force that it is and has been for so many generations of Black people. Without our anger, where would we be, right? There's also a way of thinking about, I think just, and maybe even related, I think about the Hector, I think, was referring to joy. For me, of course, I'm a Christian person, and so Sunday morning services have often been a place of joy, of sort of like this unfettered joy. And probably, for eons of Black people, that has been the case. I think about either singing in the choir and so like what that connotes for me or what that helps me to tap into. And even if it's not in the choir, I can be in my car sometimes, or walking around singing and experience like this overwhelming feeling of being so happy or connected to the memories of my grandmother singing, or it wasn't like my grandmother was a great singer. I just remember sort of like some of the joy that she would experience when she would be singing or hearing music when I was at her home. There's something about Black joy that also can be very, very much mischaracterized, or people can try to deny us this experience of joy and pride and happiness. That I also wish that sort of like would, and I know that there are scholars writing about this more these days than maybe that I have been aware of historically. But I think that we also, so like even if we think about joy and anger being sort of like connected in some ways, right? They've always been life-giving for Black people, and I think that, well, I want us to be thinking about how do we claim the expression of that joy a little bit more, and not be so worried, right? That people will mischaracterize our joy or our anger for that matter, right? We need to be free to be able to express all of those things.
That's the unapologetic piece.
Mhm.
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 Yeah.
Yeah, as we, because I am mindful of time, but as we sort of transition and think about, I think that's a good segue into really the unapologetic piece, which is part of the, the conversation I know that we hope to really emphasize this evening. But, one of the goals of racial identity development is really thinking about that positive, positive self-definition, overcoming internalized racism. As it pertains to Blackness. And as we've reflected on some aspects of our own journeys, our racial identity journeys and fight against internalized racism, I mean, I think that we've talked about some situations, but I'm sure, right, there are some folks in our lives that were really central to our own development in terms of maybe words of wisdom that they've shared or experiences that they've cultivated or curated for us. So in the interest, right, for folks who may be moving along in their own journeys, I'm wondering if we could also talk about who are some of those pivotal folks, what were the things that they may have shared that you might offer to other individuals that really have helped facilitate your development and journey into being unapologetically Black, to not offering up excuses or feeling like you need to make yourself smaller than or more palpable to other individuals.
Yeah, for me, outside of my family and some of the stories that I shared, of course, I'm still connected with my family, and they instill a lot of pride in who I am, where I come from, how I look, and more recently meaning in the past 20 years, how I sound and my queerness, because I think that's another piece, right? Being a Black queer man of African descent, immigrant, gender expression. So it's a lot of digging I've had to do and continue to do to get pride in all my other identities, which are all racialized. So in addition to my family, I think there has been a lot of powerful people that have instilled pride in me through my reading, right? Looking through history, reading history, pioneers and researchers and scientists in my field of psychology, such as Dr. Helms, Dr. Neville, right? Dr. White, right? And when I reflect about those three folks I just mentioned, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're all of African American descent, because again of the history of Blackness and anti-Blackness within Latinidad. Another person is also Junot Diaz, and I know folks have different feelings, thoughts, reaction to him, but if I'm going to stay true to myself, his book, The Brief Wondrous Life of Vasco Wild, really impacted my own racial identity. I thought I knew it. I thought I knew I was Black, not till after kind of I really started digesting. And also because he spoke about a little Dominican boy who came to the United States, lived in the New York, New Jersey area, went back. It was like, oh my God, he's writing about me. And that gave me a sense of pride as well. And then the last piece that is pride is also the folks that I work with, right? So I'm thinking of Dr. Chavez Dueñas, who's not of African descent, is not Black, but is a super woke womanista Latina of Indigenous descent. And she has really supported also my racial identity development as well. So I really want to publicly thank her for working on my racial identity. And then the last piece, I said that was the last piece, but this is truly the last piece, is that in my work, I call in my community, not because I want to clap back, not because I want to call them out, but because I love my community, okay? And I think when I love someone, I am going to call you out and I'm going to come, we need to have a conversation. And that's part of the work that I'm trying to do publicly, academically, through my research, through my writing. So to all my Latinos who are listening to me and all my Afro-Latinos who are listening to me, I am not turning my back to my people, to mi gente. Okay, I'm walking towards the arms of my raza. I'm embracing my raza negra. La raza that has been ignored, la raza that has been silenced, the raza that has been made invisible for centuries. And because of my racial pride that I now have and that I'm now anchored in, I'm able to, you know, try to not continue to support mestizaje racial ideology. And I'm only able to do that because of racial pride and because of the works of the folks I shared and because of the work of my family who supports me and our Blackness within our family.
I think about really, I think I said this at the beginning, a part of growing up in the neighborhood where I was, there were all these folks who were really affirming of the smartness, right? But still there was a piece of this that felt like it was affirming of my Blackness. So, and in some ways, it's just like almost like a shout out to the people of South 21st Street in Monroe, right? For really being folks who were supportive, folks who were encouraging, folks who were affirming, folks who saw like we can be better, we can be proud of ourselves, right? There's a piece of that really comes up for me. I think about I mean, I think I'll jump all the way to college, actually thinking about my friend Corey, who was one of the first people who ever really invested into like real conversations about Blackness with me, who was able to be challenging, who was able to be affirming, who was able to be patient. Really thinking about, if I look back on it, so like sitting with another Black man having this conversation, that was, I have a friend here, Tamia, who always says that, oftentimes relationships with Black men are not necessarily built on accountability, whereas Black women oftentimes have relationships with a lot of accountability built into them. And I think that what Corey was demonstrating or trying to lay out for me was how to be Black and be male and be in conversation and try to be accountable. But somebody who was really proud of himself and understood how race worked, understood what Blackness meant, even as a biracial person, like really deeply invested in the conversation, and for some reason saw something in me and really wanted to be in relationship, be in community with me. So he is somebody who continues to do that for me. And then, I mean, I can't really not be thinking about Miriam and Dr. Helms at BC, really trying to build up a sense of full racial identity development, right? Helping with sort of like the assessment skills that Dr. Helen was talking about earlier. It's like really trying to make sure that we're seeing what's happening in the environment so that we can be wary of the folks who are trying to snuff out our lives, while also trying to make sure that there are people that we can yoke up with who can help move our lives forward. And then how do you use your skills to be able to take care of people in the environment as well, right? There's a piece of that I think is really important. And even so, like if I think about Dr. Helms and Miriam, there's also a piece that I think that for me, just like it would go, so like generalizing to South 21st Street, there's also just been this real sense of Black women in my life who have always been instrumental in saying, come on, let's keep going. Let's be prideful, let's be honest, let's be hardworking, let's look out for our people. I think that so for me, there are so many Black women in my life who have been doing that work. And so there's the way that I relate to Black women that helps me and continues to help me to this day. And I'm always thinking about how do I honor that? How do I give back as well?
I I know I started off the segment earlier talking about my mom and that she, you know, she's white appearing, very light skinned. But despite that, she was always very adamant about saying that I'm a Black woman, right? And so her having this positive association with being a Black woman is what helped me to kind of buffer some of those internal struggles that I was having when I was younger. So definitely I would, you know, my mom is one of those people who helped instill that racial pride in me. And then I would say the other person is my uncle, who passed away earlier this year. But he was another person that, you know, was very, you know, proud about being a Black man, a Black Haitian man. And I saw how he carried himself, the success that he was able to achieve in his life, you know, being a Black man. And so, and how he responded to different situations where people would, you know, be discriminatory towards him, but he, you know, he would still do what he had to do, and you know, he succeeded. And so he's another person that I would credit with helping to instill that racial pride in me. And as I think about kind of like my other mentors, I think about Robert Carter, Dr. Janet Helms, Gerda Nicola. These psychologists really had a role in shaping who I am today, and both my professional development, but as well as my personal development, and help kind of push me along and made me feel more comfortable just voicing my opinions. I know many, like Carlton and Marion know, when I was, you know, first year doctoral student on the ISPSC research team, I was very silent, and Dr. Helms and Dr. Nicola, they would push me to talk and to, you know, voice my opinions. And so I definitely credit them for helping me to kind of push me along in terms of my own racial identity development, and also just the Black and brown women that I surround myself with. So Dr. Jernigan, Uma, Indian women who was a part of my cohort. You know, these are people who I can turn to and talk to about the kind of the struggles that I might be having, and who will affirm me and, you know, help push me along. So those are the people that I think about when I think about my own development and my, you know, feelings of pride in being a Black woman.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Keisha. I would say giving all honor to Black women in my life, first and foremost, in that regard. You know, my parents, you know, again, it wasn't until I truly became a mother and realized how much goes into like every thought, every decision, you know, that I could go back and just appreciate even walking into their house to this day and being surrounded by just the imagery and the affirmation. And they gave that to me at such an early age, which was, again, really critical from a fundamental and just foundational piece and really setting the stage for my identity development. But beyond that, not having as many, I think, teachers of color, you know, through my K through 12 experience, but, you know, Fisk University and the many folks at Fisk, including Dr. Raymond Winbush, who was my psychology advisor there, that really pushed me to go into graduate school, that told me, you know, how to do it, you know, the things that I didn't know as I tried to navigate that. And then I've been really fortunate, I will say that. I try to mentor in the way that I was mentored. I know that God sent me several angels along the way at every transition. And so Dr. Ellen Pender-Hughes when I was getting my master's, and then of course, Dr. Janet Helms, who was just really instrumental in helping me just identify and navigate the toxicity of white supremacy in academia at a very different level, and helping me rebuild my armor and remember my foundation, and to, you know, sort of get me back in touch with what I needed, which was in many cases, Carlton, you said, the surrounding myself in Blackness to kind of go back out and to be reconnected and continue the work that I have been doing. But my colleagues, my peers, I would say, are the folks that I am most able to, that push me, challenge me, but will validate me and allow me to feel, to express how I feel, as well as hold me, right, if I cannot create the narrative for how it is that I'm feeling. So in those moments of vulnerability that are so, you know, necessary, Carlton and my dear sister, really, Dr. Milena Banks, who's like our honorary, she's a psychiatrist, but honorary psychologist who I've known my entire life. We know that our mothers were pregnant at the same time. Like I've just known her my entire life, and we talk about it. We've been through every, hairstyle change. We attended undergrad together. We, did med school, grad school. She is the godmother, to my son. And she has, like many of the Black women in my life, I say Black women go hard in the paint. And so even just behind the scenes, the ways in which folks, come together and have come together to support me personally and professionally, and are my cheering squad, my dear friend and line sister, Kiana Collier-Good. Those are the folks where, like, if I'm doing something, I'm doubting myself, and it's, sort of rooted in, what may be some nuance around anti-Black, they're the first to like cheer me on, and sort of say, you could do it, swat it away. And I've just been really instrumental in my life. And I think that the words of wisdom are really about the encouragement, about being rooted and connected, and staying rooted, connected, and grounded, have been what's allowed me to both facilitate and then to sustain, and to really be in this place where I am, this is me and this is who I am, and I'm going to take up as much space as I need to, and to be unapologetic about it, and not to question myself as much, right, as I used to historically.
It's been fun hearing what people have to say, and I'll be kind of quick. I want to echo some of the Black women and honoring that. But when I want to first start off with, like, what does it mean to be unapologetically Black? And for me, it means that I will work and I will study about Black people. I will look at the process of healing. I'm all about Black liberation. I will not look to other folks for validation, affirmation, or approval for what I want to do. It was also about activism for me, and racial justice, and being in partnership with other Black, Indigenous, and people of color for our liberation. I mean, I'm all about that, but centering Black liberation. And it means that no matter what setting I'm in, no matter who is there, I will speak out against anti-Blackness and racism broadly, period. That's what it means to be unapologetically Black. I am so grateful for people, not necessarily because of the messages that they did, but their behaviors and the life that they lead. And of course, I have to start with my mom, Lillian Neville, who was just amazing, and just showed me what it means to be ethical and adopt a social justice perspective. But I think also in grad school, working with Shamar Thompson for the first year, then she left, which was good. And she was mentored by Janet Helms. And just this being authentic is so importantly critical and challenging things when you are in the face of incredible, intense anti-Blackness. I also think it's important to acknowledge the people that I learned from, that I am in community with, that are actually on the ground doing the Black liberation work. So people like Imani Bazell, who founded the Sister Net, who is really important in that. I think that's critical. And then what I also think about now, what gives me energy and the ability to be unapologetically Black, I think of like members that are part of the Liberation Lab that I work with, my students, my past and foremost students, and also the Radical Healing Collective. They give me energy because they help me name stuff. They provide space for us to validate, to dream, and to move forward, and just to acknowledge who those folks are. Dr. Hector Adames, Dr. Nayeli Chavez Duenas, Dr. Gioni Lewis, Dr. Breonna Taylor, Dr. Della Mosley, and Dr. Grace Chen. I think it's important to be in community with other folks who have similar views and that can push you in certain ways. And you don't have to, everyone doesn't have to be Black or identify as being Black in order to encourage you to be your authentic self. So.
It seems like we had one question. Thank you all for sharing those pieces. It actually is really important for us to be thinking about Blackness as connection as well. And there's a piece of what we were sharing really is about the communities that we have around us that really affirm who we are in an unapologetic way, which can be really healing and helpful. We had one question that came in, and there is a caveat on it, and maybe this will be the only question that we'll take. Not a caveat. I would like to ask the panel if they could tell educators, especially elementary educators, one piece of advice they think it is essential they know or are aware of when educating Black students, what would that be? I teach at a dual language school and a lot of my students are Dominican. So I would love to especially hear from Dr. Adames. But it's open to anybody. So advice really for elementary education folks working with Black students. You have to unmute your device, Hector.
I'm going to get a t-shirt after COVID is over that is going to say, raise the volume, you're unmuted, something. My first reaction or thought that I'm having is that Black students are already educated. Okay, when we go into the school system, we already come with an education. So I think it's important to kind of think of our framing, right? But in terms of how to help them learn the skills and or learn lessons and things like that, I think I like to always put the lens back on us, who are the instructors, the teachers, right? And say, where are we? So for the person who asks a question, where are you in your own racial identity? Because if you have not done that work and are more advanced, then no matter what kind of brilliant advice anyone gives us, it's not going to translate to students that we work with. Mm-hmm. So that's one piece. I think the other piece, especially if you said the student was Dominican, Dr. Green?
She said that she teaches, I think she said a dual language school, I think it was.
Okay.
And a lot of students are Dominican.
Yeah, and that the students are Dominican, yeah. So for that particularly, it's really important for you to really understand the Dominican experience, the complexity of it, especially around how we are racialized and think about ourselves as racial beings. So really understand that, because a lot of students, and we heard this throughout our stories, so I think one of those threads that connects a lot of us here is that once you're quote unquote formally educated, then you've arrived, you're not gonna experience racism or anti-Blackness. And that is really common. And that's what's sometimes the message that I know I received growing up, is that if you're educated, you're good to go. And a lot of that time, that formal education, we're reinforced when we are stripping ourselves of our pride, of where we come from, our racial pride, our cultural pride. Something as simple as it's let's just speak in English versus also as well as let's not tell anyone that I'm Dominican or that I'm Black or other African descent. So those are some major umbrella points to kind of think about. And of course, then there's other logistics in terms of what kind of assignments you're giving, what kind of books are you exposing the students to read and things like that. So those are some thoughts off the top of my head.
Dr. Jernigan?
No, I was thinking one of the threads, I think also, as we all shared our experiences, were how early on, right? Because the question also mentions elementary educators, but how early on in our educational experiences or in, educational school systems, we encountered experiences that had the potential, right? That presented anti-Blackness, but also had the potential to really negatively impact, right, the development of young children. And so I think as an individual in a classroom who's interacting with children, it's kind of the idea that you have the ability to either breathe life, so to speak, and continue to instill, right, a positive sense of pride and identity in young folks. Identity doesn't happen in adolescence, regardless of what people say. It's about what is said and what is presented to young children, especially, I think at a younger age, the messages that they receive, the eye contact that is made, et cetera, how worthy they may feel. Hector shared the story of being put, behind a door, and in essence, the attempt to make him invisible. So as an educator, those memories are powerful. We all are able to go back there. And so just recognizing the power and interacting with young children in at an elementary school age is really fundamental in their trajectory. And we all had different stories about the messages we received within our communities and with our families, but certainly as an educator, there's power that is there. And so I agree with Dr. Adames in terms of first and foremost starting with yourself, but also recognizing and really taking inventory of what are the ways in which you're interacting with the students in the school system and in the classroom on multiple levels. So not just talking, it's the verbals, the nonverbals, the assignments, the evaluations, the advocacy really for your students throughout the entire school system is also critically important.
I think about this question in terms of, maybe a similar place that Dr. Damanes was starting, which is about you need to know yourself. And I think that it's really incumbent upon elementary education teachers and really all teachers, educators, to recognize that they swim in the waters that teach us that little Black boys and little Black girls are dangerous or they don't need help, or the research that's out there about Black boys and the adultification of Black girls. You have to realize that you swim in that, and you have to really resist that and fight against that, because that is anti-Blackness at its core. And there's also a piece about not only being sort of like not anti-Black, but you want to show up in ways with your students that you affirm their Blackness, really speak to their Blackness. It would be a real anti-racist practice to be a teacher who affirms the brown skin of the little children of color that come into the classroom, or what is it that, do your eyes light up when you see these little Black and brown kids when they walk into the classroom? To develop a practice of being able to see the unique specialness of the little children who come into the school is one of the things that I think that that teachers may actually underestimate, to really regard your students as special, and special because they are Black, or special because they are brown, right? There can be something that's really powerful for them to receive that message from an educator, from a teacher, from somebody in a position of power, that they can walk around with, to say, no, actually, Miss So-and-so told me that I was special because of this. That can be really affirming and helpful for them as they move through the school systems, which again can be really dangerous.
The other piece that I'll just add is it's a dual language program. So language and the messages around language that the children will receive in an educational system, but also outside of, and again, being intentional and deliberate about validating, speaking more than one language versus the, predominant narrative around which languages, right? If a person speaks more than one language, which languages tend to be seen as exciting versus those that are discouraged. And I certainly have, being the mom, right, of an African-American and Dominican son, and trying to teach him Spanish, but also just thinking about the ways in which his learning Spanish and speaking Spanish is often discouraged outside of the home. And so I think there's nuance too, in addition to the population of students specifically that you're working with, but I imagine for others that may be working with children that speak more than one language as well, being very aware of things like folks attempting to or being aware that other folks may see their accents as negative, those sorts of things, which I've heard from some of my peers in graduate school, folks attempting to, in essence, erase their identity. So there's another layer there for me as well with regard to language.
Yeah, you was like you were reading my mind when it came to the accent, because Spanish accent is racialized. And oftentimes, I know I grew up, and yeah, I even got this message from my family that try to get rid of my accent because I need to sound quote unquote American, whatever that is. And like now as an adult, I was like, oh, I don't want to sound like an American. But I think those are a powerful message that starts early on, especially for bilingual kids. Some accents are like, oh, you have a British accent, how wonderful. Not Spanish accent, so.
Right. We have been going for a while now. I'm going to actually pass it off to Dr. Jernigan to close us out. Okay. I don't know the information about the diversity challenge, so I'm thinking that I'll pass this over to you.
So we do want to thank you for this latest joining us for this latest segment, Unapologetically Black. I would like to thank everyone for joining in the conversation, for helping to plan the conversation this evening. So to Dr. Adames, to Dr. Keisha, Dr. Neville, Dr. Carlton, myself, and to our person behind the scenes there helping us out and navigating some of the tech, Brian. But really, we appreciate those of you that show up, that continue to engage. It is our goal to, again, center race-related conversations, to model, to be in community with one another and with you all. We would like to encourage you to continue to follow the ISPRC Facebook page if you have not already. There will be additional conversations that we may have by way of panel on Facebook Live, but also we're looking forward to the 20th anniversary of the Diversity Challenge Conference, which happens every year at Boston College. It will be virtual this year, but it is under the direction of Dr. Janet Helms and the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture at Boston College, and registration is currently open. It is, and Carlton, you're putting me on the spot, I know, late October the 24th, 5th, the date, Friday, Saturday. I need to look at my calendar. But it is our 20th anniversary, and many of us who are alum of ISPRC have helped plan that conference, and we're really excited to celebrate how monumental it is, as Dr. Helms says, the only conference that she's aware of that has centered race and culture from its origin. So we look forward to having folks join us for panels and presentations, and also honoring the 20 years that the conference has happened. So please continue to like the ISPRC page, to share the information with your peers. We see lots of folks and get wonderful feedback, to give us feedback about other content that you may want to see from ISPRC in the future. And for this evening, I think we'll just sort of close out with a charge to you all and encourage those of you who self-identify as Black in particular, in terms of moving forward. What will you do, right, to continue to affirm your Blackness, and to arrive and be in this space that's unapologetically Black in the way that you define that, in addition to maybe some of what you heard this evening. And so I will end there. I don't know if folks have other closing remarks before we say goodnight. October 23rd and 24th. Thank you, Keisha. I knew it was the Friday and Saturday are the official dates, and registration again is early bird registration is currently open for Diversity Challenge. So with that,
yeah.
We'll
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
good night.
Good night.